Hi, this is Pastor Eric from Edinburgh Christian Church. It's Sunday afternoon, and I just wanted to share in this brief video a portion of the message that I preached on this morning at church. We're looking at the subject of faith, and today's passage that we're looking at is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. And this particular passage has always been one of my favorite gospel stories. And in this story, Jesus had just fed the 5,000 with only 5 loaves and 2 fishes, just prior to verse 22. And beginning at verse 22, the scripture tells us that immediately after that, he urged his disciples to get into the boat and to leave. And they were going to be crossing the Sea of Galilee. And so after sending the multitudes away, Jesus went up on the mountain by himself to pray and to just spend time with his Father and to recharge. So the disciples, if you can picture this, they have left. They're out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus is on the mountainside or on the mountain praying, and we're told that a fierce storm has arisen on the Sea of Galilee. And that's quite common there because it's a small body of water, relatively speaking, surrounded by the hills, kind of like a bowl. And so this fierce storm had arisen, and the boat with the disciples in it is being tossed by the waves, and the wind is blowing hard. So you have waves washing over the boat, you have the wind blowing, and they are in very real danger of capsizing. And it's into this scene that we see Jesus walking to them on the water. Now, understandably, they are frightened by his appearance. And they begin to cry out, "It is a ghost," or "It is an apparition." And Jesus, as he's walking towards them in the midst of the storm on the water, Jesus calls out to his frightened disciples, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Don't be afraid." Now, here's where the story, it's already interesting because Jesus is walking on the water and walking towards the boat. But here's where it gets really interesting because one of the disciples, Peter, who is known for his boldness and, in a sense, his impetuousness, answers, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus extends the invitation to Peter. And without any hesitation, Peter steps out onto the raging waters and begins walking towards Jesus on the water. Now, everything goes well, and everything is going well until until Peter shifts his focus away from Jesus and onto the wind and the waves. And when he shifts his focus away from Jesus and he starts to focus on the wind that is blowing and on the waves that are slapping up against his legs, he begins to sink. And terrified, he cries out to the Lord, "Save me." And Jesus stretches out his hand and takes hold of Peter and lifts him back up out of the water. And together they finish walking to the boat. But as Jesus reaches out his hand and grabs hold of Peter, he does say to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Now, as soon as they get into the boat, the wind ceases, and the other disciples worship him, declaring, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Now, it's a powerful story, and there's a lot that is going on in this story. But the thing that I want to focus on this afternoon, just a couple of things actually. I've heard many messages that have criticized Peter for his lack of faith. But the reality is that at the invitation of Jesus, he did step out of the boat and he did walk on the water. And like I shared with the folks at Edinburgh Christian Church this morning, I wasn't sure about them, but I'm really confident that I would have stayed in the boat with the other disciples and probably would have been thinking that Peter had lost his mind. But Peter was focused on something that apparently the others weren't focused on. His focus was fixed on Jesus. His focus was fixed on his Lord and Master. And so he asked to come out, and he did come out, and he walked on the water. Now, notice this also. Peter was doing fine as long as his focus was fixed on Jesus. It was only when he took his eyes off of Jesus and he started looking at the wind and the waves around him that he began to sink. Now here's the application for you and I today. There is a lot of stuff going on in our nation at this time. We're living in a time where our faith is daily being tested. We have stories all around us of the continued virus and of people that are going into the hospital and how it's surging again. We see the unrest in our cities. We see the violence that is in the streets of so many of our cities. And in the midst of all that, it's more important than ever that we have the faith to keep our focus on Jesus. Because even in the midst of a storm that is raging, and whether that storm is a physical storm like we see on the Sea of Galilee, or just the storm of turmoil in our nation, as long as we keep our focus on Jesus, we're going to be able to walk with him through the storm. And Peter did really well until he took his focus, his gaze off of Jesus. So my encouragement to each one of us today is keep your gaze fixed on the Lord. Keep your gaze fixed on the one who brings stability and peace in the midst of the storm. And at some point, the storm will be over. As soon as Jesus and Peter stepped back into the boat, the wind ceased. And the Lord will bring us through this storm and through these uncertain times. And at some point, beloved, we will be able to step back into the boat, and the waves will be still and the wind will cease. So that was one of the things I shared this morning. Just I encourage you to have faith, trust God, keep your gaze fixed on Jesus. God bless each of you, and we'll try to keep sharing these videos with you in the future. Thanks for listening.